So this is a wonderful opportunity for me to share some of these ideas that I was thinking about for, as Mark was alluding to, 25 years. And trying to do that in an organized fashion. You know, when you think about something for 25 years, you know, where's the beginning of the spaghetti and how do you make it a nice story for people like yourselves who are kind enough to show up and listen tonight. I wrote down some notes and I'm going to try to do that. But before I do, I just wanted to mention one of the things that's wrong with the book, majorly wrong, and that is I opened up the book, you know, got the first copy, opened it up with great excitement, and the acknowledgments weren't there. So, you know, I was just horrified because so many people contributed to the book, to the ideas, students in conversations with me, and I think of Alison Costell and Sarah Fetterman and my faculty colleagues, Solon and Mark, and certainly my husband, Carlos Slutsky, is a faculty colleague. Mohammed also is a student, others here. But, you know, my kids were sort of turned around and took care of me while I was writing, and my daughter Mary is here tonight, and my grandson Zachary are here, so there's sort of a testament to the family project that this book was, I'm afraid. But really my husband, who was not only contributed this idea of a better form story, which is at the heart of the book, but also he's the heart of my life, and it's wonderful to have had his support, his patient, interminable support while I hung around in my bathrobe and didn't make dinner for a while. So I want to thank everybody that helped birth this book and spent time with me thinking and talking about the ideas. And now I'll talk a little bit about the book, and then maybe we could just have a discussion about, you know, the intersection of the books or some ideas that you have. The book is entitled Speaking of Violence, the Politics and Poetics of Narrative and Conflict Resolution. And it grows out of, obviously, my interest in intersecting narrative and conflict analysis and resolution, as Mark was alluding to, kind of bringing forth this new intersection for our field and helping call attention to both the utility, the pragmatics, and the ethics, the politics of these processes, of this intersection. So let me tell you a little, I'll just try to tell this story about how the book came about for me and what I was trying to do with it, and whether or not I succeed, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I tried to look at several problems. Several problems were sort of the, let's say, there were some problems that were like swirling galactic hubs of thinking and worry and literatures that I tried to make sense of. And one of them was, in the negotiation and the conflict resolution world, as you well know, there's a kind of an instrumental rationality that's at the core of our thinking about why people do things and how they do them. I was just in a war game last week at the Center for Naval Analysis, and I'd never been to a war game before. And I'm stunned by the way in which the US government and our military actually operates as though people make rational choices and cost-benefit analysis and, you know, do things for reasons. And in fact, you know, you could watch in this war game, as we see in our scenarios in our classes and our case studies of what's happening in the world, not to mention, you know, the Senate approved the aerial bombing of Syria today. So, you know, we've got this other, you know, we've got this emergency unfolding right before us, so we don't have to look far to see the assumptions we make about why people do things and what we need to do in order to get them to stop. And sometimes those assumptions we make, and this is really at the heart of the book, and the way the world is actually working are at cross purposes, if not more tragically, we end up doing the very things that would generate more of the same and worse through the way we try to solve problems. So this rational behavioral economic model, I think, has depleted our understanding of identity and emotion, and clearly all of our work, much of our work here at SCAR is about sort of reinfusing conflict analysis and resolution for the study of identity and emotion. And I've been unhappy with that. Well, I think it's really important. It's certainly a step in the right direction. I've been concerned that we've then arrived at these sort of pseudo explanations of how people are doing things, and we just attribute it to identity and everybody goes home. And we've got this identity which is different than that one, which is different than this one, And then we've got these group dynamics literature coming in saying, well, you know, people are trying to preserve their group affiliation, and that's why they, you know, hate these other people. And it just, for me, doesn't quite get at the mechanics of actually how it works. And so I would prefer, given, and there are other problems having to do with identity research, like the fact that it's often too static. Once you have it, it doesn't change, and then we don't have a theory about how it changes, you know. So I think there are lots of problems with the identity-based approach to conflict analysis and resolution, even though it's been definitely an advance. So I think that instead what we should be doing is trying to understand the problem that I was trying to look at was how could we, what's really going on when people are in conflict with each other and trying to work through problems and solutions, long-term protracted conflict, in long-term protracted conflicts. And it seems to me that they're making sense. That's fundamentally what they're doing, and I didn't make that up. It's Jerome Bruner and many other people before him and after him. People are making sense. And so if we could understand how people are making sense, it might give us some purchase on, you know, how could we do things differently, and not only in terms of our analysis, but in terms of our intervention. Now, if you look at how people make sense, one of the things we immediately know is they make sense in terms of narrative. Narrative is the architecture, the fundamental architecture of meaning making. You can't make meaning without it. Solon likes to say that narrative is the new attitude. You know, in other words, in the same way that attitude was so central to psychological and social psychological and every other kind of research for so long, narrative has sort of replaced attitude as a central thematic and organizing principle for both analysis and intervention in many fields. I don't think we know exactly what it all means yet, but I think there's a lot of people interested in moving in the direction. So I was trying to think, okay, how can we understand these narrative dynamics? What are narratives? How do they work? And how could we make sense of this? Now then, if you look at the conflict resolution field, here's the second problem. People are writing about stories and the importance of stories, and yet they write about it as a folk concept. Let's have them, let's tell them, let's share them. Somehow things are going to get better. You know, it's kind of the idea that if you tell your story, things are going to clear up. There's an idea that marginalized people can come along and share their story as though their marginal position can be erased or somehow altered by the way in which they tell their story. So all the storytelling practices have proliferated in our field of conflict resolution as both strategies for intervention, as a way of making sense of the problems that people have. That the problem is they can't tell their story, and so we'll set up places for them to tell their story. And I believe this is enormously apolitical. It's super naive, because only some kind of stories can get told, right? And then they have to be told in certain kinds of ways, and some people can't even have their stories told, and wouldn't even know if they had one if you asked them, depending on the role, the situation they've had, the role they played in a given conflict. So I think it's naive, and I think it's enormously apolitical, because again, these spaces where stories are told are themselves crisscrossed by what, you know, Deleuze and others call lines of force, you know, these institutionalized discourses, these ways that people have of relating that set up the rules about who can talk and under what circumstances and what can be said. So this narrative meaning-making should not lend itself, or with the field of conflict resolution, I believe, is too naive and apolitical about actually what goes on there and in those spaces where stories are told. And there's not enough attention to that. So that was the other project of the book, was to try to figure out how to intersect critical theory with narrative processes. What do we know about stories, and then how could we apply what current thinking and critical analysis would tell us about what we should be paying attention to about narrative and what it might imply for analysis and intervention. Now, there's enormous, then I ran across a big paradox in all of this as I was working towards this, and that is, that's the title of the book. One of the problems that we have as human beings is that when we speak about violence in general, people talk about their suffering. And in the course of the talk about suffering, there's a reproduction of, you know, what we might call the fault lines of the way in which descriptions are made about our group, about that group, about these institutions, about this history, about the way the events are organized, about what the values should be that we're talking about. So all the apparatus of narrative, which is the plots and the character roles and the themes, get mobilized in ways that reproduce the conflict, in ways that reproduce the marginality of the people who already have problems telling a story about themselves. So the speaking about the violence mobilizes these conflict narratives and reproduces the conflict. That's one big problem. And because it reproduces the delegitimizing descriptions, which then anchor the conflict itself. So that's a problem. But then, as I already mentioned, the way of speaking that people have, how they talk about violence and what's happened to them, actually mobilizes these discursive resources that are already at play. It's rare to invent new ones. So usually what people do is follow these pathways that are already laid down, these discursive pathways, these storylines that are already the cultural resources that they have to talk about things. And they don't have different cultural resources. And they're often, even in the truth and reconciliation process, let's say in South Africa, you don't find new ways of telling the story about what happened. You find the reproduction of the same stories over and over and over and over again. I see people here interested in genocide studies, and I'm sure you could attest to that. So that's another problem, is that the discursive resources aren't multiplied necessarily when we speak about violence. So what I did then, on the basis of all these problems, and after describing narratives, try to understand, try to intersect this critical theory with narrative theory and come up with a critical narrative theory. And basically I was arguing that, you know, Galton talks about structural violence and cultural violence. Well, I think we've got narrative violence. We need to have a new way of understanding a different kind of violence, and that is the violence that's done to people when the resources they have for describing themselves in context are limited and limiting, and they cannot, by themselves, reorganize the speaking space to constitute themselves or their others differently. So the constraints on the production of narrative delimit the sort of public spaces we can create, the way we can address violence, and how we can imagine ourselves into the future post-violence. Now, I was drawing on, I don't want to say too much about this critical theoretical perspective, but I'm real, it's like Mark admitting that he's very excited about his ethical post-neoliberal framework. I'm really excited about critical narrative theory and this whole concept of narrative violence. And basically what I did is sort of mush some things around together. Arendt was very important to me. I was interested in her notion of a natality, which she says, you know, is the beingness of people. And when you think about what is it about us that makes us human beings, well, it's the way we can story ourselves. So it really comes down to what she argues for is that action, social action, requires a plurality of being. You know, a plurality. And so the question is, how can we multiply the ways of being in the public spaces where we end up talking and working on violence? How could we do that? So taking natality as a core theoretical framework as a goal for what we want to produce, and I was thinking of public spaces where violence is described and discussed. The question then comes, how could we produce those? So I went off to look at forms of narrative intervention that could be brought to bear. So the first part of the book is this narrative theory, and then a critical narrative theory, and the last part of the book is about narrative intervention into conflicts. To try to sort through what might be some practices, and how would we know if we were engaging, if we could set up the spaces for people to speak in ways that would be productive of natality. How would we know if we did that? So I had, developed some criteria for that, but also an ethics for that. So the book is about both the politics and the poetics, and the ethics are really about, it's really cool because I was an English major before I ended up doing this, and I love poetry, I love language. So when you come down to what produces natality, I argue, it's a way of interacting with other people, a way of witnessing that would support poetry. And she has a, oh dang, I lost the page if you wait a second. So I had it, of course, and I don't have it. I don't even know what, oh, here it is. So I'm really following also Vivian Jabri's work. She was our Lynch lecture last year, and she argues that in an article entitled Restyling the Subject of Responsibility in International Relations, she says, to rethink emancipation, or let's say the freedom to story ourselves, in terms of an aesthetic ethics, where the individual has the capacity to reinvent her or his mode of being, to enact a form of transfiguration wherein the individual sees him or herself as a work of art. And I would only add, I say, that the individual is also seen by the others as a work of art. So it's one thing if I can show myself to you all as a work of art. It's another thing that you elaborate me that way. That's a whole nother ballgame. So this notion of people being works of art, and then we can start to think, how would we design speaking spaces where people could really show up at these works of art as having the capacity for action. So that's the project, and then the ethos or the ethics of this have to do with not setting up consensus building. As you can see, showing up people as works of art is so far beyond, so much more difficult than creating a shared story. You know, I don't have much hair to pull out, but if I could pull my hair out, it would be over this issue of the reliance our field has on a shared story or consensus building. And I just think it's way wrong. It's very problematic because it actually reproduces more of the same. If the problem is the constraints on the production of narrative, consensus building is actually exactly the wrong thing to be doing. We should be, multiplying meaning and reorganizing the lines of force and producing better stories. So the last part of the book is about the production of better form stories. How does that work? And there's a body of literature. Some of you know, some of you very incredibly educated people in the room. I'm looking at my husband Carlos, who actually invented this notion of the better form story, but also many of the students here in the room that have worked with me, and we've worked together to develop this concept. There is a body of literature and narrative theory that says this is how you navigate, if not mediate, conflict using narrative. Now the problem with that literature, I'm going to be talking about problems in a minute, but I think the better form story is an advance over the traditional or over the existing approaches to mediation and conflict resolution from a narrative lens, because they stop at pragmatics. So we might be able to do it. We might be able to tell a better form story, but what are the ethics that surround, how would you make sense of what story was better? So is it enough just to organize for new stories to appear? And basically John Winslade, who's a dear friend, and by the way, co-editor with me of a new journal, Narrative and Conflict, Explorations in Theory and Practice. And John, who has been a visiting scholar here, and we all cherish his work, he argues for that we can use narrative to transform conflict as a modality. And he focuses on the pragmatics of how that could be done. Well, in my view, it's not enough, the pragmatics. We need this critical lens. We need to be able to think about what are the constraints on that, and what are the ethics about the production of stories, and take responsibility for infusing, for designing the spaces in a way that produces poetry, or that people can show up as works of art. So that's it. Thank you.